We're still trying to figure out how to get the YouTube or the video link to work.
Okay, I don't, it's no problem with me the way it went on, I know that.
Okay. Thank you for your patience.
Did you hit the save button?
I'm sure after a few.
I thought I did, but maybe not. Maybe that's the problem. Did I?
Yeah,
It's correct here.
And you hit the save and did the download thing? And then
There's-
I didn't reformat, but I did publish.
you know, I don't think you'll ever like
Why?
run out of.
I don't know.
There is no change to the, there's no, I don't need to publish because I don't have a pretty copy. I mean, I don't need a format because I don't have a pretty copy. I can just publish.
Right, you can just publish.
Yeah, which I did. So let me try it again.
Oh, so we were logged into that meeting, so I wonder whether it's
Stuff.
had something to do with the fact that the meeting was open and running when we were trying to change the link.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Well, I'm republishing right now, so let's hope that it'll fix it. You might want to make an announcement for
Have you
those
been,
who are-
have you been in the council chambers lately, or you've been doing it from
They
home?
want to YouTube and watch it.
Yeah.
They just can't.
I'd still be using my
I'm
laptop.
not sure if anybody's there.
So, Tel, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Because I don't like doing it from my recliner, you know?
Okay, I'm going to call this meeting of the Woodland Planning Commission to order at, looks like 7:02. One moment. The role of the Planning Commission is to hold workshops to review and make recommendations to the City Council on all manner of policy and legislative activities. In some cases, we act as a quasi-judicial board for land use cases, which can then be appealed to either the council, the hearings examiner, or a court. Janice, would you take roll?
Certainly. Be sure to remember to mic up. It's particularly important tonight with the masks on. So let me get back to my roll paper. Sorry for the delay. We've been dealing with interesting technical questions here. Okay, Brian Matson,
Present.
Sam Nigro. Is he excused?
That's a question for Tel.
Is Sam Nigro excused or is he absent?
I haven't heard from him, so I think he's absent.
Okay, thank you. Shauna Gawthorne,
Present?
Tel Jensen.
Here I am.
Thank you.
All right, so what do we got? Tonight's planning commission can also be attended
YouTube.
allegedly on YouTube, or not on the GoToMeeting as it were. Okay. So I'm going to do this anyway. At this time, I ask any member of the public who wishes to give testimony for items not on the agenda, please approach the microphone. Wait a few seconds, see if anybody busts through the door. All right. I didn't hear anybody, so next up on our agenda is approving the agenda. Is anybody interested in making a motion to approve the agenda?
I move that we approve the agenda.
I?
We
All
need a
right.
second, please?
So,
Is that-
would you say?
Second.
I second.
I
the
second.
motion. Fantastic. All right. Motion has been made by Brian Mattson and seconded by Shauna Gawthorne.
You're a natural.
Excellent first, second. All right, so is anyone opposed to approving the agenda as published? All right, hearing no objections, the motion passes. Next up is consent items, which is approving the minutes from the last meeting.
Correct.
I looked at them. I move that we approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
All right, fantastic.
I second that.
All right, motion has been made to approve the minutes and seconded. Any discussion about the minutes? Doesn't look like it. All right, anyone opposed to approving the minutes as published? No objection, the motion passes. Before we move on to our discussion workshop, I want to welcome Shauna Gawthorne to the Planning Commission. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're doing great so far.
Thank you.
Happy to have you aboard.
Thank you.
All right, so next up is a discussion and workshop, and I don't recall which is first.
I was thinking the commercial zone is first.
Okay, commercial zone first. Is there, I imagine there's a staff presentation.
Yes.
Take it away.
So the packets that you have in front of you on the desk are reflect the two items on the agenda today. The first packet that you have is a lot of the legal justification and history of how we got here. So if you don't look at that, it's just there for you to know that how we got to where we are, and so I'll go through kind of the issues that you're going to be dealing with. It's just so that you know that the reason why we're before you is because the city has a legal moratorium against accepting applications for commercial zoned projects that have a residential component, and I'll get to the background of that for why. So I think Brian and Tel are familiar with that, but Shauna, since you're not, and for the members of the public who are watching this for the first time, I'll give kind of the basic background so that everybody understands where we're coming from. So that packet is not necessarily very helpful, but I did print out copies of my PowerPoint presentation tonight that you're seeing on the screen up here tonight. So if you want to take notes, I printed it in a way so that you can take notes as you go and write down your questions. Today is a workshop, a work session, which basically means you will not have to make any kind of decision tonight. It's strictly for you to have discussions and to inform me what you would like me to work on for the meetings that are coming up. And then, of course, the actual work plan of when I would like to bring things back to you. And if you're comfortable with that work plan, I'll go ahead and put it on your agendas for the next few meetings, and we can work our way through the individual projects. So tonight is not a public hearing. You don't have to vote on anything. Anything you say tonight is on the record, but it just simply leads me to do special research or answer special questions going forward. So the fact that our Zoom isn't working isn't a big deal because we're still being recorded and we're on YouTube. So any member of the public can review this as an open public meeting. So what's in that packet is a little dense. It talks about Ordinance 1486, which was a 6-month moratorium, as I mentioned. And there was a second ordinance for 1491, and the way the state laws say is if you pass a moratorium, you have to hold a public hearing within 60 days that justifies the moratorium, and then you lay out a work plan for how you're going to address the issues and end the moratorium. And so what we're talking about tonight is developing a work plan and the codes, and it can be extended up to 12 months, which would be June 21, 2022. So work plan I laid out won't take us that long, depending on whether or not you want to hold additional work sessions or additional hearings to gather more public input. So what we're talking about is compatibility issues, and I'll bring up the examples that kind of got us here in a few slides. But the question is, do we want residential uses outside of the downtown core commercial zone? The way our code is set up is the downtown core encourages commercial on the ground floor and residential up above. But that was only in the downtown core where we have some of our older buildings with apartments upstairs, and we were trying to encourage new development to kind of have that same character. And then about 2 years ago, we noticed in our highway commercial zone that there was a cross-reference to the neighborhood commercial zone C3. And it's counterintuitive, and it's been there for probably 20 years. And the way zoning works is you can do all of these uses plus the uses in this zone. But instead of referring to the C3, we felt it should have referred to the C1. So we made this tweak, and without realizing some of the implications of that, we kind of we opened the barn door for some potential problems. And the question that you might fundamentally have to ask, and that is, did we mistakenly open the barn door, or did we purposely open the barn door? So that's a philosophical policy question that I'll bring up to you and you'll have to weigh in on. There's also some other issues that came up with this, and that is, in the downtown zone, you have a lot of small lots and a height limit. So you never really were going to deal with big, massive residential developments. But now that the barn door is open, there's no density limit. And so we dealt with Kirkland Senior Living, which was 75 units per acre. And then we had a pre-application conference for a project that was even a ton of units, but was very low density when you consider net versus gross. And so it's not normal for residential zones to not have any guidance on density. So we'll present some different scenarios in a couple minutes. And I think the other question that came up with density is bottom floor commercial. That's what the downtown commercial is looking for, to keep shops at the street level. But typically when you're doing construction, a floor of residential is not as tall as a floor of commercial. Especially if you want a restaurant, you have to have hoods, you have to have ducting, you have to have fire suppression system. So whereas a commercial building might have, 12, 15, 17 feet on a floor, compared to a residential which might have 8, 10, 12, depending on what the design is. So we don't necessarily want to overlook the fact that if there's a height limit and you can only fit 3 stories in there, we're never going to get a restaurant in that space because there's no room for hoods, there's no room for fire suppression. So that's one of the things we'll want to bring up. And we also had a project which proposed ground floor commercial parking with residential above it. And the question is that the spirit of our commercial zoning district? You could put a Coke machine in there, and as long as you're selling Cokes out of the vending machine, is that ground floor commercial with residential above it? So the question that we're going to get into, and that is what constitutes a commercial use. The other thing that came up, and this came up with the RV park project on Belmont, and that is, what are the impacts to the nearby zoning and uses? So in the residential zone, there's a 50% lot coverage. So the idea is your garage and your house can only cover so much of the property. You want to have yard, you want to have driveway, you want to have walkway to make it residential character. It's very rare that you want to have 100% of a lot covered by a residential use. But there's a hole in our code because there are no setbacks and there's no limit to the amount of impervious surface. There's also a question about environmental impacts, and so that can be either the built environment or the natural environment. So in the commercial zone, height limits, shading out your neighbor, those are kind of issues that are going to come up depending on the size of your building and the amount of parking that you have. So they're not necessarily addressed in the highway commercial zone to address any kind of residential impacts like connectivity to schools and recreation space. Like I said, if you can have 100% of a lot covered with structure, where the kid's going to play, where the dog's going to use the restroom. So those are issues that are not addressed under our current code. Pedestrian vehicle traffic will come up. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And should we give credit for shared parking or reduced parking requirements? So for example, the residences tend to have people, you go home at night, you go to bed, and you stay in your parking spot, you get up, you go to work in the morning, and you leave at 8, and the restaurant opens from 10 until 9. So all day long, the business can be using the exact same parking space that you park at in the night. So should there be some credits for uses that don't overlap? So that's kind of a sticky subject, but so is having a sea of parking and wasting our property on parking that isn't necessarily full all the time. Should ground floor commercial buildings have a higher ceiling standard? I think I covered this before. But the other issue that comes up, and that is, if you're in a zone that has a 35-foot height limit, and you have ground floor commercial with 2 stories above it, it has to have a flat roof, because if you have an angled flat roof, it pushes it up above the height limit. So really you're talking a 2-story building instead of a 3-story building. And so I think we can take a look at this, and if you're doing mixed use, depending on where the zone is, do we want to have consideration for additional height limits? Especially if we start talking about 15-foot height limit on the first, or height minimum on the first floor, so that we can ensure there's potential for a restaurant. Now you can only have 1 story of residential above it. That works in the downtown core because that's how they're designed. But in today's market, can you really pencil out a mixed use with only 1 story above commercial space?
What's our height limit in C2 right now?
I'm sorry?
What's the height limit in C2 right now?
45.
Okay.
So, and then you can have some additional height depending on how far you are back from the property line. But I think that's worth us having the conversation, because especially when you get a 3-story building, it may still be above 45 feet depending on what you're doing. So, and this would get us back to the same question of density, because it may be that if you build a 10,000 square foot building, you want to have 3 stories of residential above it, regardless of the height. In which case, we're not counting density, we're talking about a ratio of floors, 3 to 1, 2 to 1. If we go to 3 to 1, but we don't change the height limit, nobody's ever going to build a 3rd story of residential, so our code would be inconsistent. So any additional questions so far? You want me to keep
Is
plugging?
your height measured to the peak of the roof?
What's that?
Is your height measured to the peak of the roof?
It's an average.
Average.
Average of the highest
Yep.
architectural roof plane? Okay.
Yeah, so the answer is to build flat roofs, but in this weather, that may not necessarily be the best
Well, I
answer.
mean, you get half the roof
Yeah,
free and clear, right? I mean,
yes. And also, we have the commercial design standards, which don't like single unbroken roofs, so we want to have some changes in elevation to break up the roof mass and the mass. So giving them the opportunity to do, different things with the roof. Having a height limit that prevents them from doing anything creative and attractive would be a really short-sighted decision on our part. So we'll look at that. And then, of course, the comprehensive plan calls for a density of jobs at 20 jobs per acre in the commercial zone. And the question, of course, is it doesn't talk about density of residential in the commercial zone, but there's a possibility that, given the applications that we've received so far, like, stuff like storage units and RV parks, they may have an apartment in them, but they don't meet density. And they produce 0 jobs, so therefore we're not meeting multiple jobs in the comprehensive plan. So this would tend to support that idea of needing the additional height in the commercial zone to encourage commercial uses that wouldn't otherwise fit in this building, because restaurants will produce a lot of jobs. But if you can't put a restaurant because the space can't handle a hood, you've eliminated that job producing potential of that commercial property. There's also an underlying question about whether RV parks should be considered residential in a commercial zone. So if you don't live there year round, I won't comment on the merit of that discussion, just that we're going to get around to have that question because it was brought up by a significant number of neighbors for projects that we've been dealing with recently. And then how do we want to talk, or do we want to restrict the potential uses that can occur in a mixed-use building? As I mentioned before, the downtown commercial core, commercial parking lots is a use. For example, the City Hall parking lot would be considered a use. The city uses it for parking. And we had an application where they were proposing a commercial parking lot. They were going to rent the parking spaces to the people who rent the apartments. Therefore, it's commercial, and therefore, what you're going to get is a wholly residential building with commercial parking because it's rented to the tenants. So, and there's also some other funky ones that may not be applicable for residential mixed-use buildings. And so I think we can run through that list fairly quickly and check off stuff that you think is just shouldn't be there. So we don't necessarily have to dive deep into that, but it's our opportunity to look for those red flags that we didn't the first time around. So here are the examples that we're talking about. If you're familiar with this property, so here's the City Hall parking lot, grass field, this is the health clinic, and these two units are live-work residential that have been built on 3rd Street. And they have minimal setbacks because they have firewall separation between the two of them, and they have more than 50% lot coverage, but it's an example of kind of where we started to realize that even as live-work units, we can't force them to run a business out of it if it's a home, or if they rent it as an Airbnb, has that residential use now become a business and it's permitted in the commercial zone. So it's one of those items that came up that kind of started this conversation. This is the Kirkland Senior Living site plan, so if you're familiar with that, here's a side view. This is an example of, they wanted a comprehensive plan change from industrial to commercial, and the city council felt that their token spa area and pub area downstairs, it's, ended up being less than 10% of the building, and they felt it wasn't truly a commercial mixed use. But this is the unit that was about 75 units per acre. It is an attractive building. It's kind of the new style. It required the additional height, but it's an example of where we started getting into the lot coverage and the height problem in our code. This is the pre-application conference, so if you're familiar with Belmont Loop, it's just off the screen to the left, the top left, and there's a little stub called Franklin Street. And this is a triangular piece of property. The south property line is Interstate 5. So as you go up to the Walmart exit 22 on the right-hand side or on the east side of the highway, there's a triangular piece of open property. And this is an example of, they were looking at doing, what essentially function as, I think it's 6 or 8 apartment buildings with commercial space on the floor, but the ground floor was primarily parking. So there was commercial space on the ground floor, but it raised the question of, is commercial parking a commercial use? Is a vending machine a commercial use? Or, if they have an office for an accountant and 1/20th of the building is commercial space, does that constitute a mixed use, similar to the Kirkland situation where there's the token commercial and it's all residential? So there's also the issue that there's only one way to this site, and sidewalks, you could build sidewalks to Belmont Loop, but you can't get anywhere from Belmont Loop. You can't get to Walmart, you can't get up Green Mountain Road, you can't get down Old Pacific Highway, so it literally is an island where there's no pedestrian connections, there's no bike routes. So this gets to that question of, are there neighboring uses and properties that are going to be negatively affected by commercial, residential in the commercial zone. And then this is Belmont RV, and this is the case that brought up the question of, is this really residential in a commercial zone? And then this is the other RV park that we have in town. This one is existing, it's behind the AM/PM, and it's been around for a while. But this slide was in here from that conversation that we had before, so just to give you an idea of what the expectation would be if we get a chance to drive around and take a look at that. The question is, would you consider that residential if they're staying there a certain amount of time? Whether that's 30 days or 13 years, that's a debate. And then at the north end of town, this is north of the Industrial Training Center, north of exit 22 against the hillside. This is a pre-application project or proposal that we have for an additional RV park. And it's kind of another example of that residential question, whether or not RVs and park models and tiny homes, whether our code needs to consider that as acceptable in our commercial zone. So from a work plan point of view, because we haven't met for a while, and it's Shauna's first meeting, I felt that it would be simpler rather than to try and put something aggressive on the agenda to try and me put together some code and dive right into it. I figured I'd give you the introduction this month. Next month I'll come back with some code stuff. We'll do some additional workshopping. You can tell me what you like, what you think needs more work, and then if you want a second workshop, that would be January, and then public hearing in February, and then it would go to the City Council at the next available meeting for the City Council, which would be March 7th, March 21st for the first or second reading, and potential April 4th. So this gives you an idea of what I envision for a work plan that would get us to completion before the June expiration of the moratorium.
I like a couple months buffer built in there. That seems wise. Thanks, Travis. I guess at this point, we should just open it up for discussion of the commission. Either of you have any thoughts? Shauna, I'm going to put you on the spot. Anything jump out to you?
Yeah, the very last one that you just talked about, the RV. Where'd you say that was again? Exit. That.
This
Yes.
one?
Yes.
Yep. So Pacific Highway at exit 22 where the Chevron is, the Wayback Burger, the Popeyes. So the Popeyes
Okay.
is just off of the bottom here. So it's on the other side of the road. There's the Industrial Training Center.
Okay. Yes, I know.
It's
Okay.
behind the Industrial Training Center, right snuggled up against the hill. And literally Empress Estates is like right here overlooking the valley.
And this was the applicant that came in, we talked to about, he had kind of a idea of a combination RV park and tiny homes and things.
Yes, yeah. And so he actually owns some parcels up here, and this is Green Mountain Loop Road.
Okay.
And so he is thinking that he would like to do a tiny home portion of the development. And so this is from a couple years ago, and so I know they're working on some additional plans, but they're marking time and they haven't come back with any applications yet. But they are going to be watching this project, and they will probably show up to have a discussion because they want you to understand what the market is looking for and whether or not you consider it residential or commercial may set their concerns at ease, because if you don't consider it residential as a commercial use, they can build an RV park all day long.
So, just throwing my 2 cents, I don't think RV parks are commercial use, but I had less heartburn for this one, just because the property in question was tucked back and I can't see it being used for anything else, so maybe it's just a question more of what it's zoned back there, rather than this particular use there, right? But, because it's hard to get access back there, right? You're kind of behind everything, and
Yep.
you're not, I mean, the most commercial businesses want to be right on the road so you see them, right?
Yep.
And so I thought, I had less heartburn for that one. This one I don't like, right? But, again,
Well, that's what you got.
That's why I don't think that RV park should be a commercial use.
So that,
Or at least a legitimate commercial use we want in our season.
to me, that raises a question of, and maybe this is just gonna overly complicate things, but potentially like a mixed-use overlay. Instead of applying this stuff to the entire zone. I don't know that I'm gonna advocate for that at this moment, but just an idea to make your head hurt a little bit more. Anyway, did you have another question about that, Sean?
Nope, that was it. I just
Okay.
wanted to get a little bit more familiar with it.
Great.
My other thought from your presentation, thank you, by the way, Travis. Parking, that's not what we want on the ground floor. I think that's not, I don't think that should be allowed as a commercial use on the first floor. And I don't think a vending machine should be a commercial use on the first floor. And I don't think laundry machines in an apartment building should be a commercial use on the first floor, right? I think that there should be a percentage that has to be commercial, right? And none of the aforementioned uses should count. But to that percentage, geez, what if it's a small footprint building and they have to have a lobby, right? For people to come in and take an elevator or stairs, or maybe a leasing agent or something, right? You have to have some portion that has to be probably residential on that first floor. But I don't know, to what percentage you're gonna want to limit that. But
I mean,
I like 75% commercial. I'd like to have more than that, but I think that you have to allow for some part of the residential use to be on that first floor, the gateway to the floors above. Also, sorry.
No comment.
I had, in my other real life, I have a PUD where they're proposing some residential uses on the ground floor, similar situations such as this. But their justification is the units, it's like a senior assisted living type of thing. Their units on the ground floor are all ADA accessible. And so I get it, that seems like a good justification for it, right?
Yeah.
But again, we're kind of going back and forth on what percentage can be those ADA units too. So I think there should be a hard and fast percentage.
I don't think a vending machine
No.
considers it to be commercial either. I totally agree. Yes, there needs to be something a little bit more on the other side of 50%, I think, than just a vending machine. And I like the bringing in more jobs. I think that's really important for Woodland.
So thinking about, I'm loath to, I think parking is awful and a blight on the city, but I'm also kind of loath to just outright, disallow things. So I wonder if maybe instead of saying you can't do parking, say that the commercial space has to be like public facing, right? Like it can't, and I think that was maybe part of the objection to the Kirkland Senior Living project too, was that I think the council was not convinced that the commercial uses were really going to be oriented towards the public instead of the residents of that building. I don't know immediately how you would write that into code.
Right, I don't either.
Yeah.
If you have any ideas, Travis, man, throw them out, because I agree with you, tell 100% on that.
Yeah.
If you have a swimming pool for your residents, don't say that's for everybody, because it's not gonna be.
Yeah, I think there were a couple issues I saw with the Kirkland Senior Living, and I still do wish it had been approved because, far from perfect, but pretty innovative and cool project. I think the footprint, the actual like commercial that was in that space was not taking up very much square footage considering the footprint of the building. And part of that was that they had that archway under it, so the actual footprint of the building was bigger than the ground floor, which was a neat architectural thing, but it, you know, again, you know, further diminished the amount of commercial space in there. And as much as they, you know, attempted to reduce their parking, it was still, you know, an island of building in a sea of parking lot. And I think, so that leads me to a couple things. I wonder if we say commercial as a percentage of, you know, the footprint of the building, not the square footage of the ground floor. So we don't get any like pedestal buildings or not, what do they call it? Where you've got basically your ground floor is much smaller than the floors above it. I also, you know, I think some of the density concerns could be addressed by saying having a maximum lot coverage of parking. So saying, you know, you can't have more than, you know, 50% seems too big to me. 25% maybe seems on the high end too, but you can't cover, you know, beyond this maximum parking. And that, you know, it could have the effect of limiting the residential density, but it could also, you know, we have opportunities in our code for applying for reduced parking requirements, right? They don't seem to be, people don't seem to like look for them much or try to use those, but they're there, and I think those are, you know, good opportunities for creative development. I'm with you on changing the height standards. I think maybe moving to, instead of an absolute height, saying a number of stories.
I'm also in favor of that.
Okay, what else did we talk about? Oh, I was thinking, so, you know, we've been workshopping all this stuff about, you know, the state wants, basically wants us to increase density, right? And we're trying to get some credit for that. Is there, I don't recall, could we get any credit under that program for requiring residential density in the mixed use? Not like requiring residences, but if there are residents, that they'd be at a certain density. And maybe you can't answer that right now, and that's okay, but something to think about.
Yeah, can you send me an email about what you're thinking, and then I will prepare something for the next workshop?
Yeah, for sure.
Because I think there's a lot wrapped into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just gonna go on and on. I think the pedestrian element that you talked about and the pedestrian connectivity, I think that's like crucially important. So addressing that somehow, again, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I agree that that's really important. Because, you know, like, if that's done well, then residential use and commercial use, like, you know, should be hand in glove kind of thing, right? Like commercial cannot exist without people, and if they are close by and it's convenient, they are going to patronize those businesses, and that's going to be good for everybody. People don't have to jump in their car to like get a snack or buy something, or, you know, don't have to drive out of their way to gas up on their way, you know, on their way home. So I think this can all work really well if it's done right. And if it's not, then it's just a disaster. If you don't, you know, if that especially that pedestrian piece, if, you know, if you live 50 yards from the restaurant you want to go to, but you have to jump in a car to get there, like that doesn't, we're not doing anybody any good. And I think, you know, thinking about Belmont Loop, I think possibly maybe that's just the wrong place for it, but also, you know, I think there is opportunity for better pedestrian connectivity under the highway. You know, it's tough, obviously, because of on-ramps, but something to think about. And then, I guess I hope this is the last thing. As I was thinking about this, you know, just kind of mixing uses together to some degree. I don't have the code memorized well enough, but I feel like there are also some, light industrial uses that would not be out of place, either in the commercial zone or with residential uses above them. I'm thinking, like light manufacturing, maybe somebody's making clothes, maybe somebody's putting computers together or something, things that are not commercial businesses, but are still compatible with that, mixed use, I guess.
So do you want me to include the list of like light industrial permitted uses in that part of the discussion? Because it literally, we could go down it one by one and you could cross off the stuff that's clearly not applicable, or from the list of light industrial, you can add stuff that you think, yeah, that might be okay if it's less than 3,000 square feet, like an auto parts store.
Yeah.
10,000 square foot auto parts store versus, a little small mom and pop operation.
I'm okay with that if you don't think it'll bog us down too much. That sounds useful to me. I'm happy to be shouted down on that, but
I'll just put it in the form of the list from the code, and you're just going to have to take a look at it before you get to the meeting. Because we won't want to go down them one by one, but if you say, I like 8, 12, and 14, that makes it a lot easier for us to spend 5 minutes on it instead of an hour and a half.
okay, great. Yeah, that sounds excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like we can, done right, we can get our 20 jobs per acre and our, what was it? I can't remember. Our density targets were, like 16 some units per acre. I think we can achieve those on the same parcel of land, which, we have seen that expanding the urban growth boundary is not a terribly straightforward endeavor in Woodland. And I think for some pretty good reasons. So using the land that we do already have available to us efficiently seems really like a positive idea. So I definitely understand where the city council was coming from with the moratorium. I think that was probably a good idea. If for nothing else than to force us to really take a look at this and be a little bit more intentional about it. All right, I think I have prattled on long enough. Brian and Sean, either of you have any more thoughts before we move on?
Sure, I'll try to go fast. Shared parking, I'm not in favor of that. I know, I'm well aware that TEL is very altruistic as far as this anti-paving of parking lots throughout America, right? I get it, I totally get it. But if you don't have any parking, they're still going to drive cars and park all over the neighborhood surrounding the development. It's just, I see it all the time with lots of apartment complexes, for sure. You were talking about lot coverage within the commercial zones, and isn't that you typically just, I don't see a lot coverage standards in commercial zones because it's usually controlled by your landscape buffers, and then like most zones have like 15% of the site has to be landscaped. I mean, that's usually what controls some of that lot coverage, right? And you think we should go farther than that?
I think it raises an interesting question that we hadn't thought about in our code, because in the downtown core, there is no requirement for landscaping and there's no setbacks. So this is a great example where the developer put in beautiful little private backyards, but that's a luxury that I can't guarantee that will benefit any future projects or anybody else. But yeah, you're right. Typically, it's a structure with a ton of parking, and there's a relationship between the two, and that is the bigger the building, the more parking you need. Therefore, the building has to get smaller until you find that sweet spot between building size and parking. But there's no open space. And if there's no residential there, you don't need to worry about the dogs or the kids because that's not relevant. The Taco Bell doesn't have to worry about that. But once you throw residential upstairs, there's no sanctuary from the pavement or the structure.
So I feel like that one's more a matter for our parks plan.
I'm sorry?
I think that's maybe a matter for our parks plan. Just, like traditional development, everywhere in the world, there is residential with no green space like immediately on the block, right? Like, so I don't see that as necessarily a problem. Having it close by does seem.
Yes, but if we're thinking about, some kind of rooftop terrace, because they have the extra height and it's usable space, all of a sudden, yeah, it's not relevant, and urban centers use that all the time.
So do you, I know that Clark County does, but I don't know if Woodland does. Do you have like a community space requirement for multifamily?
We do.
Okay, so if you had multi-units above commercial, that would still apply, correct?
No, it's in the
different zone.
it's in the
Well, it's
multifamily
still
zone.
multifamily above the commercial.
I think we have to add it.
But, I mean, that would be a way to get some of that. And even if it's, your rooftop terrace stuff, that can still count as the open space requirement per unit,
Yes,
right?
yes. And I just had an interesting thought. You could have rooftop restaurant space or bar space as well.
Sure, there's nothing that would
we have-
restrict commercial to the ground floor, right?
Yeah.
You're just restricting residential to be above, but commercial to be anywhere.
Especially on the river, it raises some interesting opportunities, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that can be great.
Did those guys ever come in on the property next to the sewage treatment plant in the airport?
They have not.
Because that would, that'd be a slick spot for a rooftop place, wouldn't it? Right on the river,
Yep.
come on. That'd be cool, but, okay, I digress.
Any other thoughts, Brian?
No, I've blabbed long enough.
No, nonsense. We want to hear it.
Oh, Airbnbs? That's not a commercial use, by the way. I don't think that's a commercial use.
I'm inclined to agree on that. If they don't have to have, do they have to have a business license now?
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically, yes.
It's not,
They do?
it's very difficult to enforce. Very difficult to enforce, but technically they should have a business license, yes.
Okay, so I think we can explicitly strike that from our commercial uses. I'm in favor of that for sure.
So I would take it you want to just avoid that conversation as opposed to including it and making a decision on it?
Well, if Airbnb isn't listed as an approved use, then you have to say that it's not allowed, right? Just by the omission from the list. So let's ignore it, right?
Or is that
until it
part of-
goes away?
I don't know. I feel like,
You can't list everything that's prohibited, or you're
Yeah.
75 pages.
that's a good point. I just feel like that, that business model exists as an example of trying to slip through the cracks, right? So,
It's hard to classify because it's,
and that's the point, right? That's their whole business model is skirting regulation. And
In the past, when people had asked me before they started an Airbnb, the advice I gave them is that we would treat it like a bed and breakfast, which is covered in the code. And so they never came back to talk about permits, and we haven't received any code enforcement complaints against them. So that's kind of the safe harbor that I always went to, and that is Airbnbs are considered, so.
yeah, I don't know. I think I'm not sure. I agree with you, Brian, but I wonder if this is the one that they want to,
maybe
outright.
be specific.
Yeah, and not that particular business, but because there are others that do the same thing. But
And I think that will be on our list of commercial uses, so
yeah,
be sure that that's in the list of uses.
yeah, and I mean, a bed and breakfast seems to me that seems like a commercial. It does seem like a commercial use, but one that belongs in a residential area, and not one that belongs in a commercial zone. I'm open to being convinced otherwise. All right, Shauna, did you have any more thoughts? All right, last call, Brian?
Nope.
Okay, well, let's move on to agricultural zoning next.
Okay, so this is another exciting topic. So in 2018, we talked about urban growth expansion. We had 8 applicants who wanted to talk about changes to the comprehensive plan. And we considered 6 growth scenarios that included internal changes, no changes, and external changes. And scenario number 6 is we wanted to talk about expanding our urban growth boundary to include the entire woodland bottoms, because nothing happens out there that doesn't affect our road system, our school district, our utilities, and our infrastructure concerns. And one of the main complaints from the neighbors was that including it in the city's urban growth boundary means that it would be in our urban service boundary, and there would be unnecessary pressure on agricultural land conversion to urban uses of some kind, or suburban uses. Single-family residential probably was the big one. And in the 3 years since, we of course have seen a huge explosion of single-family residential applications and construction in the bottoms, and we're starting to see the impact on our school district, on our roads, and the issues that are associated with that, because why would a developer build in the city when you could build in the county and not be responsible for paying for your impacts? And so the mayor has asked me to start doing the footwork or the underlying work to get the conversation rolling about the expanding the urban growth boundary, or to do a master plan of the entire bottoms. And one of the low-hanging fruit and discussions I think we needed to have, and that is, do we need to add in agricultural zoning to the city code so that when we expand the urban growth boundary, we can tell the county that we are going to do our best to preserve agricultural land because we have zoning that is as good or better than the county. And to do that, we could start by simply adopting the county agricultural zoning, so that way they can't tell us we're going to do a crappy job because we're using their code. And if we're doing a crappy job, they're doing a crappy job first. So this is kind of...
That won't stop anybody from saying.
Yeah, so this is kind of one of those preemptive actions that we may never use it because we're not going to actually have any zoning. But from a comprehensive planning point of view, it gives us that much more leverage to justify master planning the urban growth boundary.
Would this allow people to burn on their property? I remember I heard that so many
Yeah.
times. I didn't realize it was such a hot button issue, but I heard it from several people.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, that would be allowed in the ag zoning, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's
So
obvious around here when trash burning day is.
So the city does not have agricultural zoning, and Cowlitz County actually has 3 agricultural zones: ag industrial, agriculture, and ag 38. And so what those are is, this is the ag industrial zoning. It allows for all activities associated with the production of agricultural products. And of course, there's more nuanced in the package that I gave you if you want to look through there. But it allows for businesses or buildings associated with the production of agricultural products and accessory housing, the farmhouse that goes on the agricultural property. But this one's a little quirky because it allows special uses that include a variety of uses. Typical agricultural stuff or agricultural adjacent stuff, like nurseries and related activities, livestock, stables, equestrian facilities kind of stuff. But it also says plus industrial uses like cold storage, auto repair facilities, construction yards, offices, warehouses, petroleum plants, petroleum storage facilities, industrial. And the question, of course, is maybe we might want to skip this one, and that is if you're planning industrial in the bottoms and you're in the urban growth boundary, we would want you to look at our industrial standards, not an agricultural standard to dodge being responsibly when you're developing. So this is one of the zones. The second one is straight up the agricultural zoning, ag zoning. Single-family dwellings, again, it's the farmhouse, with the agricultural uses including livestock, accessory uses, recreational uses, And it talks about hazardous material storage, but I think that's more of the throwback to the farmer who keeps feed and fertilizer and that kind of stuff on site. So it's not necessarily what an alarmist might think of as hazardous material storage. And there are opportunities in there for uses compatible with the character of the zoning district. So again, this gets back to, you know, the dairy with the ice cream store, or the milk store, and the egg store, that kind of, you know, agricultural adjacent uses. And there are also some development standards that can be adopted. They're in separate parts of the county code, but I think we could lift what we like, shoplift it, and stick it in the ag zone, so it only applies in the ag zone, whereas it's more broadly based in the county code. And then the last one is Ag 38, and it's very similar to the other two, only this one's quirky because the big lots allow for forestry and mining uses, which may or may not be relevant in the bottoms, but the zoning district, it's kind of one of those red flags that apply elsewhere in Cowlitz County, but may not be applicable to the bottoms. So I think we can spend a little time diving into this, and we may just want to go with the straight ag zoning and kind of incorporate, pickpocket the stuff we like from each of the three zones and develop an ag zone.
Didn't we had, I don't think it was last year, maybe the year before, those folks that wanted to mine sand?
I'm sorry?
Oh,
The folks that wanted to mine our, like, amazing sand on the bottoms, remember those?
Yeah, so that activity is actually probably covered in that zone, but that is dredge material from the Columbia that's deposited on the port.
Right.
And you're right, technically that is a mining activity. So, but I think our long-term planning conversation would be, that would be industrially zoned under the city zoning, therefore we would address it with our city zone, not create an ag industrial zone that would just be a bastardization of what the city wants to do in the future. But we could always go there if we wanted to. And this is from the county code, and it basically talks about lot sizes, setbacks, and some of the building height considerations that are in the code. So we'll want to have a quick conversation. I don't know that we necessarily need to do anything more in depth than cutting and pasting this and bringing it over to our code, because we are talking about zoning that would govern our urban growth boundary, and theoretically it'll never be applied, because if they annex to the city, we would assign a city urban zoning standard, and it may be agriculture, and the fact that it's cut and pasted into our code gives them some protection against future development pressure.
All right.
So this one has a little bit more of a streamlined work plan. So I think, again, code discussion and workshop next month, and then we could probably go right to public hearing. And seeing as how this is kind of not necessarily directly applicable, it's only if we expand our urban growth boundary and it provides us some political muscle and environmental or zoning muscle when we talk to the county about expanding our urban growth boundary. The actual implementation of this would be after comp plan amendments and annexation discussions. So we would have other opportunities to think about the implementation and modifications that need to be done during annexation and development discussions.
So, yeah, so maybe it's like, it's a little more than a placeholder, but
Yeah.
certainly open to tweaking.
Yes.
around. Okay.
So my immediate thoughts on that before, I didn't, when I was reading through the actual code language that you had online on my phone, which hurt my eyes, but I noticed that they had all those special uses. I'm like, oh, no, I don't think we should have these special industrial uses. No, number one, because it'll never redevelop into housing. If that's what's going to happen down the road, they'll just build houses around it, and that'll just be an ugly fit, right? They don't belong next to each other anyway, and if that area, is annexed, it's gonna go to residential at some point, so I'm not in favor of the special uses. I mean, I don't mean this as a rip or a negative on Cowlitz County, but when I first started at Clark County, somebody was telling me, yeah, Cowlitz County they don't have the zoning restricted uses that you have down here in Clark County. And the way they explained it to me, I thought was kind of funny. They're like, the good news is you can do whatever you want. The bad news is your neighbor can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I mean,
Yeah.
you want stuff to kind of fit together.
Yeah. Yeah, and they have large tracts of unzoned property even in the bottoms, right? And
Yeah. Sean, you have bringing anything up for you?
No, not yet. Still just taking it all in.
All right, great. Yeah, this seems like a good idea. I'm with Brian on the industrial stuff. I do, I also do see some value in actually having agricultural land around the city. I think, gas prices increased 50% in a couple months. It seems sort of inconceivable right now, but there may be a time coming when having ag land close by will be a pretty big asset. And it just makes sense to me to kind of hedge a little bit, right? To have that as just a resilient strategy. Maybe it never comes to pass, but maybe it does. So I think also just having an ag background, I've got a soft spot for it. I like to see around. It just feels good. And also just, I guess, the kind of cultural piece. This is an agricultural community for a long time. So having that around makes a lot of sense to me. I realize that's, maybe a few steps down the road from, comp plan zoning, but I think we're on the right track. I think it's a good idea. I think, I would hope that some of the landowners in the bottoms would, come out to give their input on that, because I'd like to hear their point of view on it too. Cool. All right.
do you think this is going to be simple enough for us to be able to do a discussion and workshop and then go directly to a public hearing, or do you think we need?
I think it is.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As
Again.
long as Tel just agrees with me on everything.
Yeah. So yeah.
And we have to recognize up front that part of this is a strategic discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because we need it as leverage for our conversation to try and get a master plan for the bottoms. And we want to be able to argue during that master planning process that agricultural land is important, and we've taken the steps necessary to demonstrate that.
Unfortunately, that's a very easy argument for me personally today, because I believe it. So, yeah, I definitely get that. I think it's a happy coincidence maybe that I think it's a positive direction to go to, apart from the kind of strategic considerations. So. All right. Any other staff reports?
So after that, basically, I just wanted to let you know that the third quarter Community Development Department report is available, and it's online. Also, the last bullet there, our new website will go up tomorrow. So we are madly trying to iron out the issues and spot as much as we can, but keep an eye out for that. And so we're really excited because it's awesome.
Well, I have to
Yep.
dig out whatever my password was to get into my email after the new update.
Well, it's
Because I don't know what that was, man. You may have to send it to me.
So that's for your email. That I can't help you with, but I can get you that. I can get it reset for you by Nextworks if you need me to.
I have the technology skills of a carrot, so I need help all the time.
So this new website, you will be able to get your packet with 1 or 2 clicks. It's going to be much easier for you to be able to log on Zoom and find your packet and watch the videos.
So
This new
clunky.
website's super slick, and we're going to be adding new tools as we
Alright.
go.
Outstanding. Would you introduce the new folks that I
Yes,
see here?
and so the clerk treasurer update, so we now have our clerk treasurer positions open. So we have Amanda Hogan, who is, took one of the positions. She's been with the town, the city for a couple months now, after working as a temp. And so also Josephine Russell goes by Joey. So she's also, this is her second week, and we're thrilled to see her still coming back after a week or two. So yeah, so we're really happy to have them back, or have them here, and they're doing some training and trying to get, this is their first time in the building, first time they've met the planning commission, so watching how it works, and so we're trying to cross-train and get everybody comfortable so that they have the opportunity to do meetings, and it doesn't all fall on one or two people, whether it's city council and planning commission. So come into City Hall and meet them, say hello, and if you need to pick stuff up, Janice and I are always available. So. Any comments?
I would like to say that I had a very busy month in October. October was the highest number of permits that I've issued this year.
Nice.
All right.
Plus working on the
Moving-
website.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
The website has been a lot of pressure, so we're really excited that we're almost there.
So you're saying we're going to go back to monthly meetings after?
What's that?
You're saying we're going to go back to monthly meetings now?
yeah,
Yes,
looks like it.
yes.
All right.
And then the other bullet item up there, and that is Melissa took a job in Troutdale over in Oregon, and so we just did interviews yesterday, and 3 strong candidates, and we're going to make a decision hopefully pretty quick and try and get them on hopefully before the holidays, and we'll see how it goes.
All right.
Great.
That's exciting. That's good. That's important stuff. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the meeting. I want to thank all the staff for putting the meeting together. Thanks, Planning Commission. Shauna, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you aboard. And now, I would like a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
I second that.
Perfect. Been made and seconded. Anyone opposed? Motion carries. Good job, everybody.